October 1944, a cold firing range near Commercy, France. Rain falls on heavy mud. Dozens of American soldiers stand in the downpour. They stand next to massive, dark green 105mm howitzers. These men are ready to train. They are ready to hear the roar of their guns for the very first time. Instead, they receive a command to stand down. They are told there is no ammunition for them. They are ordered to pretend. They must shout the word bang to simulate a live-fire mission. They are deploying to the front lines in 72 hours. They will face the German army, having never fired a single live round. One man decided their lives were not worth the brass. He chose to keep them in the dark, but he did not count on the arrival of a general who valued lead over prejudice. This is the story of how an arrogant range officer denied a black artillery battalion their only chance to train with live ammunition, and the devastating response Patton delivered to ensure his men were ready for battle. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show when one man's prejudice became another man's death sentence. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Watts was 35 years old. He came from the concrete streets of Detroit, Michigan. He commanded the newly arrived Black Artillery Battalion. Watts was a quiet man who believed in precision. Back home, he had worked as an automotive engineer. He understood how gears, steel, and timing functioned together. He had lost his younger brother to an industrial accident in the factories before the war, a tragedy that taught him the brutal cost of improper training. When the Army gave him his command, Watts swore he would not lose a single soldier to preventable mistakes. He trained his gun crews flawlessly on dry-fire procedures. He made them repeat the loading motions until their hands bled. But Watts knew a dark truth about artillery. The first time a crew fires a massive howitzer, the world changes. The deafening blast shakes the earth. The violent recoil slams the carriage backward. The thick smoke blinds the eyes. If men experience that chaos for the first time in actual combat, they freeze. He needed live ammunition to save his men. Now, he was being ordered to lead them into the teeth of the German army with nothing but empty chambers. Major Joseph Holt was 37 years old. He served as the range allocation officer. Holt came from an old, wealthy family in Hartford, Connecticut. He wore a tailored wool uniform that remained spotless despite the French mud. His boots were polished to a high mirror shine, reflecting his belief that some men were born to rule and others to serve. Holt believed that certain soldiers lacked the inherent intelligence required to operate complex modern weaponry. To him, allocating expensive, high-explosive shells to a black battalion was a waste of valuable war material. He chose to look at his ledger and see a way to preserve his resources. Holt authorized 2,000 live rounds for a rested, all-white artillery battalion to conduct casual refresher training. In the very same breath, he signed a denial form that stripped Watts and his men of their meager 200 practice rounds. He justified the decision as a routine conservation measure. In Holt's mind, the hierarchy of the old world was meant to be preserved, even in the middle of a global war. By October of 1944, the Allied advance across Europe was slowing to a crawl. The rapid dash across France after the Normandy breakout had drained the fuel depots and emptied the ammunition dumps. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles back to the coast. Shells were rationed. Every division commander fought for a share of the dwindling stockpiles. In this atmosphere of scarcity, the internal friction of the United States Army became magnified. The military was strictly segregated. Black units were frequently relegated to logistics, transport, and labor. Those few assigned to combat arms faced intense skepticism from high-ranking officers who believed they could not perform under pressure. Because of this deep-seated bias, white commanders often diverted critical resources away from minority units, leaving them to train with dummy wooden rounds, while white troops received priority for live ammunition. Many high-ranking officers looked the other way, viewing the unequal distribution as a natural consequence of wartime shortages. The systemic neglect was treated as a bureaucratic necessity. But, on the muddy range at Commercy, the line between bureaucratic neglect and outright sabotage had finally been crossed. Lieutenant Colonel Watts walked into the range command post. His boots were heavy with clay. He stood before the desk of Major Holt. Watts held the denial form in his hand. "I need to speak with you about the allocation sheet, Major," Watts said. Major Holt did not look up from his ledger. He turned a page. The request for 200 rounds of training ammunition was denied. Lieutenant Colonel, we deploy to the front lines in 72 hours, Watts said. My crews have never fired a live howitzer. They must experience the blast. Holt closed his book. He leaned back in his wooden chair. He looked at Watts with cold, unblinking eyes. The decision is final. The men cannot go into combat blind, Watts said. It is a matter of basic survival. They need to hear the guns. Your men can practice their dry fire procedures, Holt said. They can verbalize the commands. That is sufficient. A verbal command does not prepare a loader for the recoil of a 105mm gun, Watts said. It does not train the gunner to handle the smoke. We are facing a severe ammunition shortage across the entire European theater, Holt replied. We must conserve our resources. You approved 2,000 rounds for the White Battalion, Watts said. They are scheduled for a rest cycle. They do not need a refresher. Holt stood up. He smoothed the front of his spotless wool jacket. He rested his hands on his desk. That battalion has proven its worth in combat. My men are about to face the German army, Watts said. They deserve the same chance to survive. Holt stepped closer to Watts. He spoke in a low, sharp whisper. Let us be realistic, Watts. Some soldiers are suited for physical labor. They are suited for driving trucks. They are not suited for the technical demands of modern artillery. Giving them live ammunition is a waste of valuable government property. You are denying them training because of their race, Watts said. I am allocating ammunition where it will do the most good for the war effort, Holt said. Your men will simulate their fire. That is my order. Watts stared at him for a long moment. He took a deep breath. Then he saluted. I am reporting this decision up the chain of command. Do what you must, Holt said. The urgent report reached Patton's headquarters within the hour. Patton's jeep pulled up to the range office. He did not send a messenger. He did not call. The heavy vehicle skidded to a halt in the thick mud. 4 silver stars gleamed on the front bumper. The general stepped out. His helmet was polished. The ivory grips of his revolvers caught the dull gray light of the French afternoon. Every officer in the building froze as Patton walked through the door. His face was set like stone. He did not look at the maps on the wall. He did not look at the clerks. He walked straight to Major Holt's desk. Where is the range allocation sheet? Patton said. Major Holt quickly stood to attention. He saluted. It is right here, General. Patton did not return the salute. He looked at the paper on the desk. He saw the number 2000 next to the resting White Battalion. He saw the number 0 next to the deploying Black Battalion. You wrote this, Patton said. I did, General. Holt answered. It was a matter of resource conservation. Explain the military logic of training men who are resting while denying ammunition to men who are fighting in 72 hours. Patton said. Holt cleared his throat. He looked at the floor, then back at Patton. The resting unit needs to maintain their proficiency. General, it is standard procedure. And the men who have never fired their guns, Patton said. How do they maintain proficiency? They can simulate the drills, Holt said. It preserves the barrels and the shells. Patton stepped closer. His voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the room. There is no military logic in your decision. Major, there is only your logic. You have decided that the color of a man's skin determines his right to survive a German artillery barrage. You have decided that your personal prejudice is more important than the combat readiness of my army. Holt opened his mouth to speak, but Patton cut him off with a single gesture. This battalion supports my infantry in 3 days. Patton said, if they fail because they do not know how to fire their weapons, my infantry dies. If my infantry dies, we lose ground. I do not lose ground because an officer in a clean uniform wanted to save some brass. You have a choice, Major. You will redirect 500 rounds of live ammunition to Watts's battalion immediately. You will personally stand on that firing line for the next 24 hours and watch them shoot, or you will face a court-martial for hindering the war effort. Decide now. Holt looked at Patton's cold eyes. He looked at the ivory revolvers. He bowed his head. I will redirect the ammunition, Holt said. The orders were executed before the rain could wash away the tire tracks of Patton's jeep. 500 heavy wooden crates of 105mm shells were transferred from the supply depot to the muddy firing range. Major Holt stood in the open downpour, his polished boots sinking deep into the clay, forced to witness every shot. Lieutenant Colonel Watts stood beside him, watching his men open the crates. The air filled with the sharp metallic smell of brass, and the thick sulfuric scent of gunpowder. The gun crews worked with furious energy. They rammed the heavy projectiles into the breeches of the howitzers. The first massive blast tore through the quiet countryside, shattering the windows of a nearby farmhouse and sending a shockwave through the wet ground. The deafening roar made the recruits jump, but they did not run. They adjusted their sights, cleared the heavy gray smoke, and loaded again. All through the night, the hills echoed with the thunder of the big guns. The white officers from neighboring units watched in silence as the crews transformed from hesitant recruits into a synchronized, lethal force. By dawn, the range was littered with hundreds of steaming, empty brass shells, and the men were ready for war. Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Watts led his battalion through the brutal winter fighting in the Ardennes. His men fired thousands of accurate, devastating rounds in support of the infantry, saving countless American lives. After the war, Watts returned home to Detroit in 1946. He resumed his career as an automotive engineer, eventually rising to executive level. He died quietly at his home in 1978, surrounded by his family. He kept a single, empty brass shell casing from the Commercy range on his desk for the rest of his life. Major Joseph Holt was quietly reassigned to a rearguard supply depot in England shortly after the incident. He never held command authority over combat materials again. He was discharged from the Army in 1946 and returned to Hartford, Connecticut. Holt lived out his days in bitter isolation, refusing to attend veteran reunions or speak about his service. He died in 1963, his tailored uniforms long forgotten in a dusty attic. General George S. Patton never mentioned the incident in his public briefings. He made no entry about the confrontation in his official diaries. However, among his private papers, historians later found a small, handwritten note from October of 1944. It read simply, "A gun does not care about the color of the hand that pulls the lanyard, so long as the shell hits the target." Some historians have argued that Patton's intervention at Commercy was driven purely by his relentless focus on combat efficiency, rather than any progressive stance on racial equality. They suggest his priority was always the tactical readiness of his army, regardless of the social cost or the background of the soldiers involved. Others have argued the opposite, pointing out that by directly confronting the systemic bias of the range allocation system, Patton took a rare and decisive risk that few other high-ranking commanders were willing to take. What is certain is that 500 live-fire rounds gave a deploying battalion the exact training they needed to survive the winter of 1944. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have accepted the administrative decision to conserve ammunition? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about when one man's prejudice became another man's death sentence, make sure to subscribe.